What's up, everybody? My name is Dimitri Kofinas, and you're listening to Hidden Forces, a podcast that inspires investors, entrepreneurs, and everyday citizens to challenge consensus narratives and to learn how to think critically about the systems of power shaping our world. My guest in this week's episode is the always thoughtful and congenial yet uncompromisingly opinionated chicken with his own Substack, Doomberg, or as our mutual friend Grant Williams likes to call him, Doomy. And today's conversation is extra doomy because unfortunately the news cycle has given us plenty of reasons to feel that way. This was, as you might expect, a very informative conversation. Doomberg is especially good on breaking down what's happening in energy and commodity markets, so it's no surprise that we talked about that, as well as the investment opportunities in uranium. But we also discussed the renewed lockdowns in Shanghai and how they compound existing global food and supply chain issues, and how those issues are part of a larger set of challenges that are going to lead inevitably to food shortages that are going to hit the developing world particularly hard. And that has implications for everyone on the planet, even the developed countries, but especially the Europeans, who will experience even more migratory pressure into Europe from Africa and the Middle East, which only adds to the destabilizing political forces that we've described so many times on this podcast. That part of the episode, along with a discussion about the future monetary system, are all in the second half of our conversation, which is available to premium subscribers only. Since some of this episode deals with markets and investing, it should be absolutely clear that nothing we say on this podcast can or should be viewed as financial advice. All opinions expressed by me and my guest are solely our own opinions and should not be relied upon as the basis for financial decisions. And with that, I hope you all enjoy this wonderfully engaging and deeply informative conversation with my good friend, Doomberg, the extra doomy chicken with his very own Bloomberg terminal. My brother from another egg, Doomberg. Welcome back to Hidden Forces, my brother.
Dimitri, it's great to be here. Real pleasure to be back with you. I was joking with you off air that we should make a habit of recording our morning phone calls and releasing them as daily podcasts for your paid tier, because endless source of interesting entertainment and amusement for both of us, I'm sure.
Yeah, we've had tons of fun. We've gone through different phases in our relationship where we talk more or less. And it's always useful for me to speak with you, man, because your interest areas and the stuff that you're particularly good at in many ways range outside of my own. And so it's complementary, but we share, as we were just discussing, actually, we share, and this is similar with Grant Williams as well, we share, I think, many of the same core values, which is why we get along so well. So it's great having you back on the podcast. This is a rare recording in the sense that I haven't prepared for it. And in fact, I truly have not prepared for this conversation. And that's also by design, because I wanted to do something a little different and because we know each other. So I guess let's just start right at the top. First, for anyone who doesn't know who you are, people, like I said, this is your second time on the podcast. People should visit our last conversation. I can't quite remember the number, but it was a conversation where we focused in part on energy markets and also on the creator economy, I believe. What can you tell those who aren't familiar with you about who you are and why you are a little green chicken?
Happy to do so. And again, really appreciate the opportunity to be back. It's a critical time for the Doomberg team, as you know. So Doomberg is the anonymous publishing arm of a bespoke consulting firm. In our real lives, we are sort of a small think tank, and our clients hire us to study problems and recognize patterns in ways that might escape pre-existing teams and to help them crack difficult problems. And one of the things that we pride ourselves on is our ability to communicate crisply and to explain complexity to oftentimes lay audiences in a way that they can understand. The old adage is, you haven't taught until they've learned. And we've also developed some clients in the content creation business over time and helping them run their businesses better. And they and you and others, similar content creators, encouraged us to start our own franchise. And the Doomberg brand was conceived almost a year ago today. And we launched our first piece on May 3rd. And it's been an incredible journey. We're coming up on our 1-year anniversary. And during the month of April, we are transitioning from a free newsletter to paid. And so now we're setting about the task of building a business out of this and making this truly the work of our lives. And so it's really great to be on your show during this time, and I appreciate the opportunity for this discussion.
Yeah, I was going to mention that. When did you turn on the paywall? Was it about a week ago, wasn't it?
Yeah, it's a week ago today. We're recording this on Wednesday. So yeah, it's been well, you know what it's like. It's been a roller coaster of emotions and stress and success and worries and concerns. And the avalanche of support from our readers has been really touching and meaningful. And of course, the avalanche of hate from people on Twitter and in the comment section of the piece is hurtful. And we're human beings, of course. And so we try our best to focus on the former and resist the temptation to dwell on the latter. And it's just sort of the way it goes in the modern internet era. I'm not sure if you know this, but there's some mean people on the internet.
Yeah, I've heard about those people. We can talk about this actually towards the end. I'd like to, because I want to also talk about your subscription model, but also in general, as content creators. Again, you write so insightfully about commodity markets, energy markets. You've been so ahead of the curve on energy in particular. But also you've written a number of pieces that's part of your series of the Work of Our Lives pieces where you talk about content creators and you feature certain content creators. The most recent of which was this Scandinavian, like Swedish, this ridiculously, inexplicably strong dude. I saw him pulling giant tree trunks up, to build this house on his own. Anyway, we will talk about that later. Before we do that, what have you been focused on recently? Like, there are so many things in the news. I tweeted out before we started this recording that you were going to be on the podcast, and I asked people what we should talk about. Should we talk about the prospects of double-digit inflation, the energy crisis, the food crisis, the Shanghai lockdowns, World War III? There is so much doom in the air.
we picked a good time for a great name. Well, I have a proposal. Let's start with how you texted me this morning. You said, "What's on your mind this morning?" And I responded by saying, "How units of measurement often obscure reality and are used as a tool of propaganda." And I'm sure you thought I was kidding, but actually that's the subject of our next piece.
Of course, I didn't think you were kidding.
That's the subject of a piece we're working on right now about natural gas and trying to frame just how big of a challenge it will be for Europe to wean itself off of Vladimir Putin's gas. And we start the piece by talking about units of measure. And it's one of these things that everybody sort of knows, but doesn't really spend much time thinking about. And units of measure that you select to describe something has a big impact on how that message is received and read. And so we start with a couple of jokes, of course, as we often do in our pieces. If you take oil, for example, everybody in the world knows that oil is priced in barrels. And there's 42 gallons in a barrel of oil. And one of the things we observe in the media, and now that you hear this, you won't be able to sort of unsee it when you read it. Every time there's an oil spill, the volume of that spill is quoted in gallons, even though the universal measure of oil is in barrels, which makes for a much bigger number. And so how you measure things and the units in which you express that measurement can be deceiving and can be misused. But we tell that story because in reality, for the natural gas market, there is no universal metric. And it's almost impossible, even for people who spend a lot of time studying energy, to wrap their brains around what these numbers mean. And so just for example, in the US, natural gas is priced in dollars per million BTU. In Europe, it's priced in euros per megawatt hour. Production can be measured in billion cubic feet or billion cubic meters or million metric tons. And so there's all these different numbers, and it's really impossible to sort of make sense of the scale of things. And so what we are doing in this piece is we're using a fixed frame of reference, which is US daily production of natural gas, billion cubic feet per day. And then we're measuring the size of the bogey in Europe and what it means for the potential for US LNG export capacity to fill some of that hole, and what it means for the global LNG markets and where that gas will have to come from. But once you sort of levelize everything into the same unit of measurement, then you can have an intelligent discussion around what's possible and what's not. And those are the types of pieces we write for our audience. We specialize in first teaching ourselves and then explaining things that most people assume everyone else knows, but in reality, very few people understand. And so we bring those topics to the fore. And we're not, as we say in the piece, we've never been afraid to be the person in the crowd that raises our hand and risks asking a dumb question, under the theory that if we don't understand it, there's probably at least a few other people in the room that don't either. And so that's really what we're thinking about. We're obviously thinking about energy. That's our specialty. The impact of the war in Ukraine Nobody bats 1,000, of course, but we've had a pretty good run of predictions, especially in the commodity fertilizer energy vortex, which has really been almost sad to watch unfold, as we said in our last piece about calling a global famine. Never have we been more sure or more desirous to be wrong.
So I'd love to apply that framework to the statistics around inflation. Maybe we can do that later. But you mentioned LNG. What's going on there? So, like, just to be clear for listeners who aren't familiar, and you can explain this to them, LNG is liquefied natural gas, and there is a shortage of natural gas in Europe. There is a surplus of natural gas in the United States in the sense that we are producers of natural gas at great quantities, but there isn't currently a sort of robust supply chain between the United States and Europe, which would also require not just the liquefaction of natural gas, but also specific LNG tankers and also places to offboard that LNG in Europe. So what is that whole process? What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so as you said correctly, the problem with natural gas is that it's a gas. And so it's difficult to transport, as opposed to oil, which is a liquid and easier to transport. And then the easiest of the fuels to transport is coal. It's a solid, you just sort of dry bulk carriers, no problem. With natural gas, it's different, especially if you're trying to ship that natural gas over great distances. And so over land, this economic way and the relatively easy way to ship natural gas is through a pipeline. And the U.S. has, for the most part, a substantial network, a spider's web of natural gas pipelines that brings the gas from the fields in which it's produced to the homes in which it is burned to create heat, or to the fertilizer plant in which it is converted into ammonia, and so on. Europe has such pipelines, but they originate in fields in Russia for a combination of reasons. There's an awful lot of environmental NIMBYism in Europe, not in my backyard, and they've outsourced the production of their own natural gas to a dictator who doesn't like them, as we've discovered. We've been flagging this as a key risk for the entirety of the Doomberg pieces. And of course, worst case scenario, in a war that we didn't think would happen, but now is here, we find out that Putin has a lot of leverage over Europe, and Europe is panicking. And so, as you said, to get natural gas from, let's say, the United States to Europe, you need to first chill it to very, very low temperatures so that it becomes a liquid. And that's what happens in these LNG export facilities. And there's only so many of them. They're incredibly complex. They take billions of dollars to construct and years to complete. And the U.S. has been steadily building out an export capacity since the shale gas revolution. And today, it went from not shipping any LNG, a decade ago, to being the world's number one producer of LNG for export, ahead of Qatar and Australia, the other two main producers. Once this gas is chilled into its liquid form, it's loaded on these giant cargo ships that have they look like giant bowling balls on them, and these spheres are filled with the ultra cold natural gas, and these are highly insulated, but they still take some energy to sort of maintain. And some of the natural gas is used, in fact, to maintain the chill. And then it's shipped overseas on these giant carriers. There's something like 450 of these in the world. We're not short on carriers, but we are short on both export facilities. And then when they arrive at their destination, they get offloaded and converted back into gas. So these are called regasification facilities. And of course, this is explosive stuff. And so it requires all manner of sophisticated engineering to do this safely and to prevent leaks, because, methane is a pretty severe global warming gas. And so what limits the global trade, so natural gas is not a global commodity, unlike, say, oil and coal. Oil and coal have their regional disparities, but the disparities in price for natural gas in various regions are pronounced. And in fact, at the peak of the natural gas emergency in Europe, well before Putin invaded Ukraine, the ratio of the price of natural gas in Europe to the price of natural gas in the US reached something like 15 times. So the price of natural gas, say, in the US was trading at $4 million per million BTU, and the Dutch TTF contract was trading at, $60 or $70 per million BTU. And that's not something that is sustainable. It's totally destructive to the manufacturing base in Europe. And now we're stuck with this major constraint that everyone is so actively trying to relieve. And that's the purpose of the piece we're writing now, is to sort of frame just how big a challenge that will be.
So you may not have the answer to either of these questions, but I'm going to ask them, and maybe you do. One is, why has there not been an incentive to build out the infrastructure for a global natural gas market in the form of LNG. And also, again, you may or may not know the answer to this. Is there a sort of general premium that we can identify for the cost of LNG over natural gas if it's produced and consumed domestically? In other words, as you highlighted, it's an energy intensive process. It's not the most efficient thing to take natural gas, convert it to liquid gas, take it across the ocean, and then convert it back into gas in order to use it on a different continent. So how much more expensive is it to do that? Those are my two questions.
Yeah. So broadly, over time, there is an incentive, of course, to do it. And many companies have tried and some have succeeded. There's a reason that we are able to export some 12 to 13 billion cubic feet per day, our LNG export terminals. In the long run, it is inevitable that arbitrage will work to close these massive price gaps and spreads that exist on a global scale. The incentive is very, very strong. If you can buy gas in the US for $6.50 per million BTU today and sell it in Asia for 30 or in Europe for 40, there's going to be people who are going to try to capture that arbitrage and make a lot of money doing so. The reason that we do not have a global market yet is these things take time, and there is extraordinary pressure to defund such projects on the part of the ESG crowd, and Wall Street in particular has made the financing of these projects more difficult. There's lots of movements to defund the fossil fuel industry. This is, of course, insane and is a direct leads directly to the famine we're about to experience. But this is just the reality on the ground, and companies in those industries have done themselves no favors over time by some of their behavior. And so we're not here to say that they're, models of corporate citizenship, but the world gets 85% of its energy from fossil fuels today. In order to replace that, you need an awful lot more nuclear than we've allowed ourselves to construct. And you need a lot more time because let's say the energy payback period on a solar facility is 4 or 5 years. Well, that means you have to spend up front 4 or 5 times the amount of energy that plant will produce in a year. And that energy comes at the expense of other things you could be doing now, like making fertilizer or powering tractors to farm and to harvest. And so these are all trade-offs and choices integrated over time. We're in the situation we're in. And one of the main points of the natural gas piece we're working on now is there's just no easy solutions here. It's not like you can flip a switch and make a $5 billion LNG import terminal on the coast of Germany and suddenly wean yourself off of the natural gas dependency that you've done to yourself with Putin's Russia. And to your question about the costs, in the long run, in a totally efficient market, the spread would be as wide as the cost to ship. And, for things like coal, that spread is very narrow because on a per pound basis or a per ton basis, it's very cheap to ship. So I don't know what that number would be, but it certainly wouldn't be 500-600% like we're seeing now. I imagine you would, if gas was trading at, $5 per million BTU in the US, it might trade at $7.50 in Europe, or a couple of dollars spread would probably get it done. But I don't know the exact answer to that question.
Also, and I don't know to what extent some of the different ships can be retrofitted for different purposes because everything has become so much more customized over the last several decades. But LNG tankers are the least customizable. They are very specific.
Yeah, you can't do anything.
Right, retrofittable, rather.
No, you can't do anything but ship natural gas with an LNG carrier. These are they're really miracles of modern technology and engineering. And you look up their construction, these are truly giant ships. And that's the scale you need to make the energy penalty you referred to earlier worth, the juice worth the squeeze.
Yeah, totally. We actually did an episode with Greg Easterbrook on the global shipping industry that I actually recommend for listeners because it's interesting when you take that episode and you combine it with an episode we did with Peter Zeihan, thinking about how the breakdown in global security and potentially the retreat of the American Navy from patrolling universally all the shipping lanes and maybe doing selective security, what impact that has on the choices that shipbuilders and purchasers make in terms of how big the ships are? Because, and this is actually the larger observation, Doomberg, that maybe we can talk about as well at some point or while we get into this conversation, which is that the entire world that we've been living in over the last 40 years, but certainly the last 30 years, has been built with a single incentive in mind, which has been maximizing efficiency. Because all the issues around security, all the things that would cause a normal trade-off between resiliency and efficiency have been sort of reduced over time. But now we're moving into a world where concerns about resiliency are popping up again. And concerns about resiliency over efficiency are inherently inflationary. And that actually brings me to another observation, which I'd love for you to comment on. And maybe it's more of a question too, which is, how much do you think about the wasted opportunities of decades of low borrowing costs in the United States when you look at the situation today with the need to build out all this new infrastructure just at a time when interest rates are rising, borrowing costs are rising, and if the United States government were to decide to reduce interest rates and borrowing costs in a kind of financial repression, it would come at the cost of someone else or something else.
Yeah, I did just listen to your most recent podcast with Russell Napier on this concept, and it was really a really fantastic episode, and congratulations on putting it out. We think about this problem a lot, and we've written about it a lot. And in fact, the biggest beneficiary of our manufacturing exodus, of course, is China. But as Zeihan correctly points out, and I went back and reread chapter 4 of his Disunited Nations, which is really, every time we think we're getting too doomy, we just watch a Zeihan video and we realize that we're probably not doomy enough. But China, through a combination of cheap energy and, we'll say politely, cheap labor, some would say slave labor, they systematically went about the task of assembling the key manufacturing supply chains for the critical ingredients that will run the economy, and also the key ingredients that are needed to affect any change in our energy infrastructure, namely the solar and wind supply chains. Many of the key sort of raw materials for lightweighting of vehicles flow out from China. So you're talking 70, 80, 90% production market share. And of course, China is utterly dependent on imports for its marginal energy. And the energy crisis that started in Europe leaked into China through contagion mechanisms like LNG pricing. And so suddenly China was paying multiples of what they had sort of planned for to get their hands on natural gas they needed. And you'll see that they have completely reverted back to hammering out as much coal as they can. Impacts on the environment be damned. And so, but what we've seen is price of polysilicon up 5x, 6x, the price of steel, the price of coking coal, the price of thermal coal. All these markets are interconnected. And so, as you say, not only is there a lot of time to reconstruct this manufacturing base needed here in the US, but there's also huge labor constraints. We don't have the workforce that's been trained to do these types of projects, by and large. There is, of course, still people in the US that view this as a bump in the road and are unserious about the true state of emergency we find ourselves in. Like, we should be on a literal war footing. There's an actual war going on that could leak into NATO countries and involve a hot war between, two superpowers. And we're still messing around with nice to haves on the environmental side and nuisance lawsuits and unserious politicians who think that energy can be produced with the waving of a wand. The president is more concerned about the price of gasoline at the pump than he appears to be about food inflation, given the policy of allowing more ethanol to be added to gasoline over the summer months. It's time that we got serious. We wrote a piece called A Serious Proposal on U.S. Energy. And I suspect that the midterm elections will be very interesting. And I think that there'll be a political price to pay for finding ourselves in this situation.
Yeah. So again, a lot to unpack there. Listeners will know that I've given the Biden administration credit where credit was due, specifically in how they handled the lead up to the invasion of Ukraine and the information war. But you have been convincingly critical of the administration's energy policy. And I think that's something that we do need to discuss. And not just the Biden administration, Europe as well. And again, you've written really intelligently on this. give our listeners just a basic summary of what you think, in a nutshell, if you could describe it simply, energy policy in the US and Europe has gotten wrong. And then let's talk a little bit about not just what can be done to improve our situation and what also you think will inexorably be done, just based on the math here, but also who is in a position to do that. In other words, you're a sort of thought leader in this space. You've put out a lot of thought pieces on it. Who are the people in positions to implement the types of strategies and plans that you've put forward?
So we've certainly been critical of the Biden administration, but we should say up front that the U.S. is in an infinitely better position on energy compared to Europe. We are effectively energy independent. We do, of course, import and export at the margins for various peculiarities about the manner in which, certain refineries are constructed and the types of grades they can accept. But by and large, the U.S. is swimming in energy abundance compared to our European allies. The people who deserve the most critique are the leaders in Europe who blundered their way into an epic energy crisis, which we believe emboldened Putin to think that he could invade Ukraine with minimal consequences because he felt like he held all of the energy cards.
Can I ask you something right there before you continue?
Yes.
One, how much of that, the fact that we're in a better position, is simply by good fortune, the fact that we have a large energy bounty? And two, why do you think, if you have a view on this, that European politicians and policymakers blundered so badly here?
So take the questions in order. The primary reason that the U.S. has such a energy advantage are sort of threefold. One, we have amazing deposits. These Appalachian gas fields are, the biggest, most prolific in the world. And there are many similar fields that could be exploited, but because of NIMBYism and political resistance and environmental radicalism, they're not. So Europe has its fair share of frackable gas as well. The second reason is we have a suite of very innovative companies in the US that have cracked the technology. Again, when people think of technology, they think of Google or they think of Facebook or they think of, the next Silicon Valley, unicorn. But in reality, the amount of technology and engineering innovation embedded in the fossil fuel industry would blow your mind. I've walked an LNG export facility, and it's a symphony of pipes and noise and pumps, and it's a miracle that it works. So we have the companies that have innovated. And then third, actually, this is sort of a bit underappreciated, but the regulatory regime in the US is a bit scattered, and certain states, for example, if a pipeline doesn't leave the state, well, it's a lot easier to construct. And so Texas has a really amazing energy infrastructure. Louisiana has a great energy infrastructure. And in fact, the federal government, sort of broadly speaking, regulates federally, but within states, most states can basically do what they want on the energy side within limits. And so we have a heterogeneous relationship with energy in the US. So for example, New England has impaled itself and is doing its best to imitate Europe, whereas Texas and Louisiana and the Gulf Coast have a very vibrant energy production infrastructure. And so for those reasons, the fact that we have this abundance of deposits or, oil fields and natural gas fields and associated natural gas with the oil, and the second, that we have the technology ability to exploit it, and the third, we have sort of a looser regulatory structure where the states have more power than, say, you might find in Europe. Why has Europe blundered is a really great question. All kinds of theories. The cynic would say it's corruption. Perhaps less cynical view would be that Russian disinformation agents funded anti-fossil fuel and anti-nuclear developments so that the Europeans would be forced to rely on Russian natural gas. Or third, there's just a lack of competence and scientific training amongst the political leadership, both here and in Europe. And I honestly think, most politicians simply don't understand where energy comes from, the fact that energy is life, and that you should treat your energy investments in the same way that you would treat a financial investment. There's this sort of energy return on energy invested phenomenon here. It takes a ton of energy to replace fossil fuels, and the path function really, really matters. And so the speed with which Europe tried to move was probably a critical blunder. But there are pretty credible reports that Putin used proactive disinformation campaigns. And, there's no question that the net result is that Europe is beholden to Putin, and there's not much they can do about it in the short term.
Something I just thought of now, which is that Europe, unlike the United States, has to manufacture a sense of identity. And over the years, I think that one of the driving forces behind European policy has been the need to create these artificial Schelling points or flags around which European countries can rally and forge a common identity. And one of those common identities in Europe was this Green Revolution. It was a core part of the European identity, this common agreed upon view around the move towards sustainable, renewable sources of energy. Does that resonate with you?
It absolutely does. And the analogy here in the US would be California.
Yeah, we should have joined the European Union.
Yeah. Look, California, to its credit, for example, has led the way on fuel economy standards for automobiles and emission controls. And there's many, many great things that the EPA has done that we're personally grateful for. And as I said earlier, these large companies have not always behaved correctly and leave themselves open to valid criticism. But I do concur with you that there is a huge part of the European identity, and the wisdom of that can be judged by the listeners, but the key element of their unity is this belief that they are going to lead the world away from fossil fuels and towards a greener energy suite, which will prevent and shave off their perceived worst case scenario risk of climate change. And as laudable as that goal might seem, it is incredibly difficult to pull off. And the path function really matters. And unfortunately, we're learning both of those lessons right now in real time.
Yeah. And, to that point, obviously in the short term, ways in which this policy has cost the environment has been, for example, in the burning of coal in order to supplement the lost access to natural gas or oil or whatever particular fuel source has gotten too expensive to use. But also, there are things that you can't properly calculate, like, let's say, the risk of nuclear war that arises from a destabilized geopolitical environment because one side has grown extraordinarily weak or dependent. And that's the thing that I think I struggle with. I'm sure you probably struggle with, and we know a lot of people in common who do, which is that all of these public conversations are taken, and this was true also during, like the Bush years around terrorism, right? We have to do everything we possibly can to prevent another terrorist attack. Well, no, that's not true. Like, there are costs to everything. And so all these debates, unfortunately, become politicized, and they're broken down into talking points, like most ridiculously recently, right? The Biden administration's talking point that it's Putin's price hike. And right,
Yeah.
and right to your point, and what we've been talking about up until now, you guys have been writing about this, and you're not the only ones that were aware of this in the United States and could have informed the president had he cared to listen. But this is something that goes back before the war in Ukraine. So to bring it back to my original question, since we've kind of established some of the basic outlines of what you think we did wrong and what the Europeans have done wrong, what do you think the path is going forward? How much do you think that, quote, ESG related policy initiatives and policies within corporate America as well will change as a result of this? And will that happen during, let's say, the next 2 years when you have a Democrat in office, or is it going to take the election of Donald Trump or some Republican to change that policy?
Yeah, great question. And it's something we spent a lot of time thinking about, and we were willing to put out a proposal on it. We wrote a piece a few weeks ago called A Serious Proposal on U.S. Energy. And let me walk you through the priorities that we would propose are critical if we were in charge of the government. So the first one would be, and again, this is U.S. based, and I know you have a global audience, but if the U.S. gets its energy policy right, we can do more to minimize the consequences of the blunders we discussed earlier. So first thing we would do is seduce natural gas investment. The U.S. has this enormous privilege of sitting on all of these resources and has the technical know-how to do it. What's really needed is basically an emergency committee of government that rewrites the rules, fast tracks permitting. We talk about how we have this, all of these fields require pipelines to lift the gas out of. And, there's a pipeline, Mountain Valley Pass, for example, is something like 95% complete. It's been permitted since 2017 or 2018. And some 3-judge panel put a halt to it, and it's going to delay, the opening of that pipeline for at least another year. That kind of nonsense needs to stop. And we need to differentiate between the fossil fuels. Natural gas is the cleanest burning. It's very abundant. It has lots of advantages. It can be used for both heating homes, for making chemicals like fertilizer, and for creating electricity very cleanly. And that needs to be the top priority. Second is we would reclaim global leadership in the production of polysilicon. We delegated 90% of this to China. It's time we took it back. And the way we would do that is we would propose to co-locate polysilicon production in natural gas fields or alongside them, right there where it's being produced. And we would take global leadership of the production of affordable solar panels from China and back to the US. This is a win-win for both sides. The environmentalists would get a domestic solar production capacity, and the drill baby drill crowd would have a new market for its natural gas, which is decidedly cheap in the US compared to globally, like we discussed. The third, and perhaps the most important, would be we need to recommit to nuclear. It's almost criminally negligent how Germany is shutting down nuclear power plants in the middle of an energy crisis and how few nuclear reactors have been built in the US. It's the safest, cleanest, greenest, most energy dense form of energy available to us. And it's literally insane that we're not exploiting that. The nuclear waste counterargument is a total canard. That's a solved problem. It's used to slow the development of nuclear energy, but there's just no excuse for California to be considering shutting down its last remaining nuclear power plant in a time of national crisis and global crisis in energy. And then lastly, we would course correct on the adoption of electric vehicles in the following way. A battery pack for an electric vehicle consists of many, many, many precious materials, expensive materials like nickel and cobalt and lithium and copper for wiring. All of those materials take an enormous amount of energy to mine. And we believe we should pivot from full battery electric vehicles to plug-in hybrid electric vehicles because battery supply and the materials available to make batteries is currently the constraint. And it's sort of a classic management 101 is that if you have a constraint, you have to manage to it. And if your metric is how many gallons of gasoline can we abate per pound of battery, having one giant battery in a car versus spreading that battery over 10 plug-in hybrid electric vehicles allows you to abate way more gasoline integrated across society. And it's not too late to course correct. The adoption of electric vehicles is still in the early phases. There's simply not enough battery materials to convert the existing fleets in the Western world from gasoline to electric on a time frame that matters. Far better to use those limited batteries across as many vehicles as we can to abate 80, 90% of the gasoline that people would use in their daily driving. Those are 4 simple proposals. They're all doable. They require zero technology. They require financial investment, and they require regulatory certainty and regulatory speed. We are not yet at a point where we've suffered enough for people to settle on those. Those are basically the laws of physics dictate those 4 proposals. We will have to get there eventually. It's just a matter of how much pain we're willing to suffer before we get there.
So I want to talk about nuclear because you had the CEO of Sprott Asset Management on recently, and you interviewed him. You released parts of that transcript, and I believe the full interview is available for your premium subscribers. But I'm curious to understand where the bottlenecks are here. So your proposal on hybrid, even for someone who doesn't know anything, sounds like super reasonable because it also, again, to the point about resiliency, it also leads to a more resilient fleet of cars. You're less reliant on one source of energy. Now you have this dual use system. You have both gasoline and battery. Because I haven't studied this at all practically. Maybe you have. Where and how does policy get made here? Who are the players involved? Who are the people that are in the Biden administration that would be responsible for this? I mean, how much do you understand about that process and where it's getting gummed up here?
So in the US, again, it's a combination of federal and state oversight. So we are seeing, for example, the easiest thing we can do is to simply stop closing these plants and invest what's needed to keep them alive longer. These facilities are incredibly safe. They produce enormous amounts of power. One of the most important things that people don't understand about electricity is the difference between baseload power and intermittent power. Nuclear is the highest capacity factor source of power there is. It's 92%, really incredible. It's great for baseload. You can't really create an electric grid with a high amount of renewable inputs, which are intermittent, unless you have a concurrent amount of steady baseload power, which allows for a reasonable operation of the grid. It's just a fact. And Germany's finding that out.
Texas, I guess, found it out.
Well, California certainly found it out with rolling blackouts. The situation in Texas was sort of a freak weather event. These are just facts. And so the easiest, quickest thing we could do is to stop the closing of these nuclear plants that are scheduled to be mothballed. The bottleneck is regulatory and NIMBYism, of course. One of the things that we call for in that piece was a focus on small modular reactors. That technology is exciting. It's developing very quickly. These could be rolled out much quicker, much cheaper, more proliferated, less concentrated risk of an accident or an event because they're smaller and the consequences are more manageable and so on. The technology exists. It's just a matter of regulatory approval and the speed with which it can be done. But for sure, Germany just closed 3 nuclear reactors, and they have their last 3 scheduled to close at the end of this year. In the piece that we're working on now, we're going to reframe the consequence of that decision in terms of how much LNG you would need to offset the closing of those nuclear reactors. And just to show people, this is an easy thing to do. What's going to be quicker? Restarting those reactors and not shutting down the existing ones, or building out massive LNG export-import facilities and making the problem even harder by shooting yourself in the foot. That's the criminal negligence that we see. That's the most infuriating, the most frustrating, the least scientific. And one of the key villains in this story, and it just must be said, is Greenpeace. No organization has done more to distort and harm the environment than Greenpeace's stance on nuclear energy. We're seeing in Germany today the direct substitution of nuclear power with coal. You tell me how that's sane. It's not sane. It's stupid. It needs to stop, and it needs to be called out.
Right on. So I mentioned that you had the CEO of Sprott Asset Management on Doomberg recently. That interview and the investment opportunity in uranium is something that I definitely want to discuss with you in the second half. I also want to talk about China and Shanghai in particular with its renewed COVID lockdowns, and that will also naturally lead us to a conversation about global food systems and the risk of famine in many parts of the developing world. And of course, no conversation will be complete without a discussion about the future of the global monetary system, which I know is something that interests both of us and which was a big part of my conversation last week with Russell Napier. But before we move it into the second part, I just want you to have a chance to tell my listeners about the Doomberg subscription model and how they can sign up if they're interested.
Yeah, appreciate the opportunity, Dimitri, and this has been a great conversation. I'm looking forward to the overtime, which is always fun. So yeah, Doomberg had previously been free, and as content creators, you're always faced with the choice of, do you take on sponsors? I know you have gone listener-supported with a mix of free and then premium. Substack is designed for subscriptions, and so we've decided to pivot from free to paid. We're still free for the month of April, but after April 30th, all of our articles will be behind the paywall. We'll still be producing lots of content on Twitter, of course, which is the other place people can find us, at DoombergT. But at doomberg.substack.com, come May 1st, all of the articles will be $30 a month or $300 a year for a discount. And then we have a Doomberg Pro tier, as you mentioned, where this is directed towards sort of high net worth, family office, and investors who would like a bit more of our research. And so we provide that tier with much more thorough background on each of the pieces, some source materials, our thoughts for that audience that might not have made it into the piece. And that tier is an annual only fee of $1,200. When we decided on pricing, we analyzed the sort of top 40 content creators in the finance space and tried to price ourselves near the median. And those were the numbers we settled on. And then, of course, we've set about the task of trying to build a base of subscribers, and it's going very well. Like you said, we opened the paywall a week ago, and we hope to be doing this for decades because Doomberg is truly the work of our lives. And it's just such a pleasure to be able to do what you love for a living, as you know. And we've admired you and your work and tried to sort of follow in your footsteps to the best that we could. And so appreciate the opportunity to make that plug.
Shucks. Well, it's been great following you on this journey. I've seen how much you guys have wanted to do this and find your niche, and you've really been great contributors to the space. So anyone interested in what we discussed today, as well as any of the topics that you guys write about, should definitely subscribe to Doomberg. And that reminds me that we are also listener-supported. Hidden Forces does not accept any advertisers or commercial sponsors. The entire show is funded from top to bottom by listeners like you. If you want to access the second part of today's conversation with Doomberg, as well as the episode transcripts and intelligence reports. Head over to hiddenforces.io and check out our episode library, where you can also become a premium subscriber today. Doomberg, stick around. We're going to move the second half of our conversation onto the premium feed.
Can't wait.
For more information about this week's episode, or if you want easy access to related programming, visit our website at hiddenforces.io and subscribe to our free email list. If you want access to full episodes, transcripts, and intelligence reports, which include additional notes, resources, links, and other material that will help you get the most out of each and every episode, check out our premium subscription, available through the Hidden Forces website at hiddenforces.io. Today's episode was produced by me and edited by Stylianos Nicolaou. For more episodes, you can check out our website at hiddenforces.io. Join the conversation at Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Hidden Forces Pod, or send me an email at dk@hiddenforces.io. As always, thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.